Okay, here we are in part 2 of our discussion of John Rawls's A Theory of Justice. In part 1, we discussed a little bit his method of thinking about justice. We talked about social justice and why his view of justice was social. We talked a little bit about the original position and using this as a hypothetical social contract bargaining situation where rational and reasonable contractors would come together without knowledge of their ultimate position in the distribution of benefits and burdens in society, and come up with principles that they would all agree on. And presumably, if they agree on them, then they think that those principles leave them as well off as they can possibly expect to be. Okay, so let me put the bottom line up front, as they say, and give you the two principles. Right? Ultimately, for Rawls, the original position yields two principles. Why not one? Why not three? Scholars have wondered over the years. Rawls thinks there's at least two principles. One principle covers what you might call civil rights and civil liberties, and he calls this the principle of equal liberty. And the other one covers what we would call distributive justice today, right? Dealing with economic inequality and economic opportunity. Let's address each one of these in turn. Okay, the principle of equal liberty. He says each person has an equal right to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, which is compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for all. This sounds very American in a way, right? Equal basic liberties for all, justice for all, right? None of this has been particularly controversial, and most of the scholarship, quite frankly, has not focused on this first principle, the principle of equal liberty. There are some parts of it that are worth delaying over for a little minute. So, for example, what does he mean by a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties? Well, again, I think here he's saying not merely negative liberty, right, but also positive liberty, some means of realizing my equal liberty. So, you know, if to have a fully equal vote, I need some minimum of education. I need some minimum of leisure time to read about public affairs and to be able to formulate an opinion independent from brainwashing, independent from the influence of too many other people. And so that's going to require society as a whole, perhaps the government, perhaps other organs in society, to create that space for people to fully exercise their liberties. If some people have the time and the leisure and the education to engage in politics, and other people don't have the time and leisure and engagement and resources to engage in politics, then they don't have fully adequate equal liberties. One set of people has technical liberty or negative liberty, but not the full range of liberties. So I think that's worth noting, right, that the scheme has to be fully adequate, and that has some consequences in terms of the setup of society. That ultimately government will have a responsibility to see that education is done, whether that's through public education, some mix of public and private education, or subsidies for an entirely private voucher-driven system. That's a public policy question, but government will have a responsibility to make sure that people are capable of participating and exercising their liberties, participating in the political system and exercising their liberties. And so there's going to be some teeth or some consequences to this principle. Now, but why? So I think one question one could ask is why? Why does each person have an equal right to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties? Well, no one in the original position, Rawls reasons, knows where they're going to end up after the veil of ignorance is lifted. But what they do know is that they're going to have interests. They're going to have what he calls a conception of the good. They also know that other people won't always share those interests. That other people will either have conflicting interests or just different interests that don't really touch upon one another. And so individuals will know that once they get out of the veil of ignorance and get out of the original position, they will need freedom. to pursue those interests, whatever those interests they may be. So everybody knows that they'll need freedom. No one's going to accept any less freedom than anybody else. Remember, they're rational and self-interested contractors. Everybody's got a veto on proposals, so no one's going to accept less liberty than anyone else. So equality, from that perspective, makes a lot of sense. No one's going to accept any proposal that gives them less liberty to pursue their interests than everyone else. So as a result, the contractors, Rawls thinks, would settle on a principle of equal liberty because, again, not knowing what their interests are, they will simply agree that everybody should have a right to pursue their interests. Okay. The contractors, remember, see society as a cooperative venture for mutual gain. So they recognize behind the original position, behind the veil of ignorance in the original position, that if there's nothing in it for others, they're not going to be able to secure those other people's cooperation. And remember, everybody has to agree. This is a social contract situation. Everybody has to agree to the bargain. It's not a majority rules, right, situation. It's everybody has to agree. So the idea of equal liberty reflects the idea that the bargainers behind the veil of ignorance can't pick principles to regulate a society that sacrifice some for the sake of the others, without there being a real risk that they end up the ones being sacrificed. Remember, they don't know where they're going to end up. So what this does is this rules out utilitarian principles, and that's actually a really interesting result. And arguably, the biggest influence that Rawls had on academia in the United States was that, for a while at least, he really utilitarianism was really on the back foot because he came up with this argument, this perfectly rational seeming argument, that nobody would agree to utilitarianism behind in a fair bargain. No one would agree to utilitarianism because utilitarianism leaves open the possibility that some people get sacrificed for the sake of others, for the sake of greater aggregate utility of the rest. And Rawls says, no, we're each individuals, we each have liberty, and we're all equal. Could we possibly agree to perhaps get sacrificed at the end of the day? No one would agree to that behind the veil of ignorance, Rawls thinks. No one rational, self-interested would agree to that. And so that ended up being a very strong argument against utilitarianism. Utilitarians have made some progress since those days, but utilitarianism disappeared from academia for a good long while, largely under the influence of Rawls and people who thought like Rawls, who put this kind of political liberalism, shall we say, to the forefront. One that has a deontological flavor, one that ultimately has its roots, yes, in the Hobbesian social contract theory, but also in Kant and deontology and this idea of respect for persons, and that each person ultimately has a veto, in some sense, over the rules that will apply to them in life. Okay, so much for the principle of equal liberty. That's not where a lot of the action has been. Where Rawls has generated a lot more ink, a lot more controversy, is with the difference principle. The difference principle states, social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions. First, they must be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. That's not the one that people really get upset about. And the second, they must be to the greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society. Why does this follow from the original position? Again, somewhat controversial, the idea that society needs to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society, right? We can spend a minute talking about fair equality of opportunity, but again, that one makes sense straightforwardly from the veil of ignorance. We don't know where we're going to end up in society, so it's rational to propose that equality of opportunities to attain positions that one might desire. We don't know what positions we're going to desire. We just know that we need some opportunity to achieve our goals. We don't know what our goals are, but we know that whatever they are, we're going to want some opportunities to achieve them, and so we want society to leave us with some opportunities, right? And since we wouldn't agree to have any less opportunities or any fewer opportunities than anyone else, then of course we're going to ultimately settle on a principle of equal opportunity, because we don't know whether we're going to be born rich or poor, right? Disabled or able-bodied, or even, very talented athletically. We don't know. And so we would want a principle to be able to cover all the possible situations, not knowing where we would end up. We would probably be somewhat risk-averse, Rawls thinks. We wouldn't take a lot of chances. We wouldn't want to end up as well off as we could possibly be. Okay, so we would want equality of opportunity. And if we understand society as a cooperative venture, then that secures the second part of the principles, right? The second part of the principle is the one that I said was a bit more controversial, the one that says that social and economic inequalities must be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. And this principle sometimes is called for short maximin, right? You maximize the minimum, the greatest advantage to the least advantaged members of society. What's the argument there? Well, since bargainers do not know whether they will be rich or poor, black or white, able or disabled, male or female, Rawls thinks that the rational person will not gamble. By maximizing the position of the least well-off members of society, a bargainer will ensure that he will be as well-off as he can be given his current ignorance, right? Again, back to this risk aversion. We don't know where we're going to end up, but we know it could be pretty bad, so we want that position to be as well-off as it can be. Note, however, and I think this is really important, I might have a slide talking about it later, I've forgotten, but I'll mention it now in case it doesn't come up later. What's really interesting here is that from a position of equality, right, everybody is equal behind the veil of ignorance. They don't know whether they're going to be rich or poor. Rawls thinks it would be completely rational to permit inequalities of income, wealth, and so on and so forth. It would be okay, rational, even just or fair to allow inequalities as long as those inequalities serve those who are the least well off. What's an example of that? Well, imagine doctors, right? Doctors, in order to be a doctor, you have to go through a lot of training, and you have to go through a lot of certification. It's very difficult. You have to be very intelligent. Have to have a prodigious memory sometimes. So being a doctor is difficult. But being a doctor doesn't just benefit you, right? A society with a lot of gifted doctors, or a lot of gifted car mechanics and engineers for that matter, a society with a lot of gifted people in it is a better society to live in than one where they're not gifted. Now, understanding people is mostly rational and self-interested. What's it going to take for people to become doctors? Well, an equal wage isn't going to cut it. Right? Rawls, I think, is sensitive to the lessons of communism and sensitive more generally to the problems inherent in collectivistic distributions of income, where everybody gets the same income. Rawls says, look, it's going to be necessary to incentivize people to put forth the effort to become doctors and engineers and even car mechanics, because good societies are ones where there are lots of those people around. Healthy societies require lots of doctors. And if we're going to have a healthy society, then we need to make sure to make it worth their while for people to go through the arduous, rigorous training that it requires to become a doctor. So Rawls thinks that even people in a situation of equality, even if you know that you're going to end up with less money, you're going to end up with than the doctor, right? Even you would agree to have less money than the doctor as long as you're well off as possibly could be. So if you're very healthy but have a little bit less money, that's a bargain that you would absolutely take, as opposed to being sick and have the same amount of money as the doctor, but not have access. Well, the doctor who didn't become a doctor, right? Who ended up becoming something else because society didn't provide adequate incentives to become qualified in that way. And so, Rawls, this idea of getting to justifying socioeconomic inequalities from a position of absolute equality, again, very, very interesting, right? That ultimately rational and reasonable people who are self-interested would accept unequal distributions of income as long as it was to their maximum benefit compared to any other possible distribution. And this means that there's room for socioeconomic inequalities. Now, Rawls doesn't think that it would require much, but that's an empirical question, right? We'll come back to that probably later. Okay, back to the slide that we're on, the full value of your liberties, right? What the difference principle does in some ways is work with the first principle to make equal liberty more meaningful. Ultimately, this is a liberal view. A liberal view is one that puts freedom and equality at the center of politics, right? The word liberalism, comes from the word liberty, and this is a fundamentally liberal view in the sense that it takes freedom very seriously, and it says, look, if you really want to be free, it can't be the case that people just leave you alone. If you really want to be free, you have to have the means to exercise that liberty, and the difference principle at some level means that everybody can exercise their liberty because no one is probably left too far behind anyone else, right? There might be some rich people and there might be some poor people or poorer people, but none of those poorer people will be will have any less equal liberty because of their poverty, or at least that's how Rawls imagines it. Now, a lot of academic ink has been spilled trying to figure out how much inequality Rawls' view can tolerate. Rawls himself, his politics seem to be fairly garden variety 1960s, 1970s social democracy, right? On the left wing of the Democratic Party of the 1960s and 70s, right? Someone who was probably very happy when George McGovern ran for office, for president, and I'm not saying this ironically, I'm just saying this is where his politics probably were. He probably thought that we could do with a lot less inequality in society. He probably thought that justice required a whole lot more government involvement in the economy and in society more generally. Okay. But for that conclusion to be true, you have to understand the world working out in a particular sort of way. Right? You have to have a particular vision of how politics and government works, and you have to have a particular vision of how the economy and capitalism work. If Rawls is wrong about one or both of those, then it might turn out to be the case that government needs to either do a lot more or a lot less than what Rawls himself had imagined, because of course his assumptions are operating with his understanding of social science from the 1960s and 1970s, and we might think differently today about the way the world works than we did back then, or than Rawls did back then. Again, remember there's a method here, and then there's two principles, and then arguably there's also a third stage of the application of those principles. What does it require to make those two principles real? So there's perhaps even a third stage here where we're trying to not, even if we agree with Rawls' principles, we might disagree about exactly how much inequality they permit. Exactly how much do you need to reward doctors in order for them to supply their talents to the market and provide the sort of optimal societal benefit of their talents. We might disagree about that. So for Rawls, massive economic inequality would be a social injustice, right? No one would agree in advance to a scheme that enabled some to exercise disproportionate influence over the political system that regulates the basic structure. So this imposes some general limits, right? If it's the case that some people are so rich that they can essentially buy themselves political campaigns, that they can buy themselves seats in office, all right, well, then Rawls says that's got to be too much, because that threatens the equal political liberty of other people in the system, right? Sure, you need to incentivize talented people to bring their talents to market and supply them so that we can all benefit from those talents. But you can't incentivize them so much that everybody liberties or equal liberties come under threat because those people now suddenly can buy things that no one should be able to buy. Right? Remember, Rawls doesn't intend. There's so many debates about what Rawls would say about a given social policy, because Rawls doesn't really intend his principles of justice to apply to every transaction or every piece of legislation, right? He wants it to apply to the background institution. So it's really difficult to say, what would Rawls think of affirmative action? What would Rawls, I mean, we know what Rawls thought of those policies at the time, right? But what would Rawls's views imply about affirmative action? What do they imply about our welfare policy? What do they imply about competition and regulation and all these things that people debate about and right and left? You know, I think most people interpret Rawls the way Rawls himself interpreted himself, which is to say, in a kind of social democratic sort of way. There is a minority of scholars out there, however. There are a certain number of people out there who take a very different view, who thinks that Rawls had a really brilliant idea about how we can come up with principles of justice, but they think that at the end of the day, Rawls completely misinterpreted, because of a bad reading of social science and poor economics. They think that we should interpret Rawls very differently, right? They think that the two principles ultimately should lead to a much smaller government, much more focused on a sort of a narrower range of tasks, and giving much more free play to mutually voluntary market transactions, right? And of course, at the end of the day, the answer is also going to depend a lot on what you think the major causes of objectional inequality are. So back to some other lectures in this series. in this course, if you're taking a course where we talk about what the causes of inequality really are and how we diagnose where the problem comes from. So I think what Rawls' view actually cashes out into, is a shortcut for saying what sorts of policies he ultimately should endorse, given the principles that he endorsed, depends a lot on how you think the social, economic, and political world actually works. And this is not settled social science, right? There's some things that we know, but there's a lot of things that we debate. Okay, so the bottom line. Bottom line is this. The set of principles or rules about how to distribute the surplus from social cooperation is called distributive justice. How does society distribute the burdens and benefits of social cooperation? The government does so through taxes and regulation, right? Taxes and regulation are the tools with which the distribution of burdens and benefits are spread or are distributed. On the other hand, the private sector also has a role to play. Society, culture, norms, also to a certain degree, things like social stigma, right? Distribute benefits and burdens, make it okay or less okay to belong into a particular category, right? For Rawls, all of these are appropriate subjects of distributive justice as long as interference would actually remedy the situation. So what this means is that, from Mill's classical liberalism, where the intent was to try and carve out a zone within which individuals were in some sense sovereign, a zone in which the government could not and had no authority to interfere, on Rawls's view, that's just not the case, right? We're back to Hobbes, where the government ultimately has ultimate authority to settle the distribution of almost everything in society. Of course, like Hobbes, Rawls thinks that governments ought to and should provide for a wide space of freedom, a wide sphere of liberty within which people can act. He thinks that as a matter of fact, but that's kind of a contingent fact, right? He thinks that this would happen because that's his reading of what it requires to make social justice happen. But if it turns out that we need to do a lot more to make social justice happen, to make the background institutions just, then Rawls is kind of committed to doing that, and the sphere under which we are free would presumably shrink as a result, because we would no longer be free to act in ways that upset Rawls's favored distributional patterns. Okay, so Rawls has a reputation for being the main inspiration for social democratic policies in the United States. Rawls himself thought something along those lines was a requirement of justice, if you thought about justice the way he did. I think a recent rash of scholarship has challenged this assumption, right? Rawls believed all of this because he had a relatively optimistic view of the government's ability to competently administrate the basic structure of society. He thought that bureaucracy was generally benign. He thought that ultimately well-meaning people would end up serving in government, and ultimately thought that government operated on a very different logic than the market. Conversely, he had a relatively pessimistic view of the consequence of market arrangements and a relatively optimistic view of, as we said, government planning. But of course, if you challenge these assumptions, right, as I've been saying all along, it becomes not so clear what the two principles really imply in terms of the range and scope of government activities in society.